Hello, Sarah of SEK Handmade here, and welcome to my Learn to Crochet series. Today I'll be sharing with you one of the tips that I share with all of my in-person Learn to Crochet classes, and one of the tips that they find to be the absolutely most helpful tip. I'm going to share with you a tip on how to keep track of your beginning and end stitches of each row. Let's go. One of the things that I have found my students struggle with the most when they are learning how to crochet is figuring out exactly where the end stitch goes in each row. They always seem to question, is this my final stitch or have I already stitched my final stitch? And if you find that you start out with a certain number of stitches and you slowly grow in and in and in, this might be a tip that helps you stop doing that. So what you need for this tip is whatever you're crocheting, and I'm going to work some single crochets, but this works with any size stitch you're working. And you need 2 stitch markers, one for each end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my chain for my next row, and then I'm going to work my very first stitch. As I said, I'm working single crochets, but it works with any type of stitch. So I've worked my very first stitch of that next row, and then I'm going to put a stitch marker in the very top of that very first stitch. Now, it can be a bit confusing to see what's your chain and what's your first stitch. So I encourage you to put your stitch marker on right away when you finish this first stitch without moving on to the next stitch, and here's why. If you look at the yarn coming off of my hook, it is coming out of the center of the V of my first chain there. So that is where I'm going to put my stitch marker. I'm just going to take my locking stitch marker, slide it into that first stitch, and lock it, and then work the rest of my row. Once I've gotten to the end of my row, and I already had some fabric worked, but you can do this from the very beginning of your fabric too. I'm going to chain my chain, turn my work my very first single crochet. Again, remember that yarn on my hook is coming out of my very first stitch. I'm going to take a second stitch marker and insert it into that very first stitch. So now I have the first stitch of the last row and the row I'm currently working on marked. Then I'm just going to work across my row, and I'm working a fairly small swatch here, and so I could easily just count these stitches, but man, especially when you're working something big, simply putting a stitch marker in your first stitch every row can really cut down on the counting, because now I'm down here at my other end and I'm not questioning whether this is my final stitch or not. I just know it was the first stitch of my last row, and so it's the last stitch of this row. So I'm just going to insert my hook in that final stitch and work my stitch. Now I can remove this stitch marker from that row I've already worked and use it for my next row. So work my chain, turn my work my very first stitch, find the top of my first stitch, insert my stitch marker, lock it into place, and keep going back and forth and back and forth, no longer guessing or counting over and over and over again to make sure that I'm keeping the same number of stitches. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you did, I would love it if you would like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications. And then be sure to check out the rest of my Learn to Crochet playlist. There are lots of tutorials and tips there to help you work through all the beginning stages of learning to crochet. It is always my goal to help you grow confidently in your craft. Thank you so much for joining me, and happy crafting!